Okay, sorry, I'm having some problems here with my being really annoying. Okay, sorry, just bear with me. Keep chatting.
Yeah.
What time's your
Try and
flight,
switch it.
Brenda?
Sorry? Oh,
What time's your-
late. About 10 to 10.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we're meeting Jeanette and Robin. They're on the
Oh, that's
same
nice.
flight.
Lovely. Safe travels.
Thank you. How are all the kids? How are the new baby?
Yeah, gorgeous. Thank you, Baruch Hashem. Yeah, lovely.
And the twins?
Yeah, also lovely. Yeah, they're 9 months now.
Oh, you're so blessed. Lovely.
I know.
We've had lovely cuddles.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm
We've got to-
sure.
You've got to do that one as well. Okay, got it.
Oh, yeah. Got it. Yeah.
Just trying to figure this out. Okay, it's just restarting. Just 1 second. Are we still on?
Yes.
Can you still see the share? No.
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Right. Okay. Progress. Right. Still not letting me switch network. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Right. I'm just switching network. Oh, now I'm hearing myself twice. These things are sent to try us. Right. Okay. There we go. Right. No. Back on. Right. Here we go. Iris, over to you. No.
No.
Yes.
Hasn't come on yet.
Finally. Okay. It's on.
No.
No. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, the Parshas of Tazria and Metzorah continue the discussion of the laws of Tumah v'Tahara, ritual impurity and purity. A woman giving birth should undergo a process of purification, which includes immersing in a mikveh, a naturally gathered pool of water, and bringing offerings to the holy temple. All male infants are to be circumcised on the 8th day of life. Zarat, often mistranslated as leprosy, is a supernatural plague which can afflict people as well as garments or homes. If white or pink patches appear on a person's skin, dark pink or dark green in garments or homes, a Kohen is summoned. Judging by various signs, such as an increase in size of the afflicted area after a 7-day quarantine, the Kohen pronounces it tameh, impure, or tahor, pure. A person afflicted with zarat must dwell alone outside of the camp or city until he is healed. The afflicted area in a garment or home must be removed. If the zarat recurs, the entire garment or home must be destroyed. When the Metzorah, the leper, heals, he or she is purified by the Kohen with a special procedure involving 2 birds, spring water in an earthen vessel, a piece of cedar wood, a scarlet thread, and a bundle of hyssop. Ritual impurity is also engendered through a seminal or other discharge in a man, and menstruation or other discharge of blood in a woman, necessitating purification through immersion in a mikveh.
Okay, heavy stuff, right? So we know that there's a degree of what we call chok, right? Laws that we don't understand the reasons for purity and impurity. The ultimate one being the red heifer. Said even Moshe himself didn't know the reason. Sorry, King Solomon didn't know the reason. I think it says Moshe possibly did know the reason. Maybe the other way around. Anyway, there's certain types of logic. I mean, it's interesting. If you look at last week's Sedra and this week's also, talks about someone who touches someone who's tameh and someone who sits on the same surface and someone who's in proximity. And we had all of this during COVID, but nonetheless, it's quite an abstract thing. There is a theme though. A lot of this impurity seems to be connected to our mortality, right? If we look at the times that necessitate purification, right? It's a woman that's menstruated. No, it's not about period shaming women. It's the fact that menstruation represents loss of potential life, right? It's somebody who's been in contact with a dead body or a dead animal, things like that, amongst other things. So we're going to have a little look at some of this and holiness and childbirth and sort of Jewish ideas about this in today's lesson. So thanks. The beauty of Rabbi Sacks is he quotes people I wouldn't be able to quote because I'm not familiar with them. So we start with Hamlet, to be or not to be. Here we go. Right. Who would like to read Hamlet? Possibly in an appropriate language. I don't know who, Serene McKellen or something.
I'll do it. The
Go on.
1,000 natural shocks that the flesh is. It's all right, the picture's in the way. Here,
Oh.
does that mean too?
You have to click, or you can just move it. Yeah.
Oh,
If you drag the top of it.
yeah, I can. So to is air to.
Right. So we are physical beings, we are souls in bodies, and we basically, as Hamlet said, we are very mortal. I think there's a whole, it's called the mortal somethings. And Hamlet, the mortal, I can't remember what it's called. I looked it up, the mortal something. It's all about our mortality, right? It's a very real thing. The mortal what, sorry?
Coil.
That sounds right. Yeah, the mortal coil, right. So, this is what we are. That's the reality. We have immortal longings, but we are all constrained by our mortality. That's the reality. Let's see what Maimonides has to say, a bit of Jewish philosophy. Right, who'd like to read number 2? Guide for the Perplexed.
I'll read that.
You feeling perplexed? Okay, off you go.
We have already shown that in accordance with the divine wisdom, Genesis can only take place through destruction and without the destruction of the individual members of the species. The species themselves would not exist permanently. He who thinks that he can have flesh and bones without being subject to any external influence or any of the accidents of matter unconsciously wishes to reconcile two opposites, namely, to be at the same time subject and not subject to change.
Okay, so just to summarize that a little bit, right? It's impossible to live in this world and not be affected by physicality, right? We're all aging, right? It affects us in different ways. That's reality. We're all ultimately, one day, till Mashiach comes and we have eternal life, we're all going to make it hopefully till 120, but it is 120. And you can't avoid that. A person who thinks, as he says, you can be a physical being and not be affected by physical needs and physical realities, right, is wrong. And it's something we say in Judaism is not the way, right? I spoke about this on Shabbos, that, mitzvahs are, many of them involve material physical things in a material physical world that we occupy, right? So Judaism does not advocate for, denying that and pretending it's not true and, it's all an illusion. There is an interesting discussion about whether the whole world is just an illusion. I think Breslov Hasidus talks about that. But the reality is, this is the reality we have to live in. We're all getting older, we're all one step closer to death, and we're all mortal beings, and we are affected by, the world around us and all the things that go on that have a physical impact, right? How often, you can have people that are physically fine but age mentally, or you can have the opposite as well. People say it's very frustrating, saying my mind is fine, but my body is, getting older, right? And the challenge of aging and reversing aging, people pay huge sums of money for that, right? All this cryonics where they freeze you, right? In Russia, I think they do it now, where they freeze bodies because people think they might come up with a cure for aging one day. So this is the reality. The reality is we're mortal. The interesting aspect of this is, anyone familiar with Taharas or familiar with generally Chevra Kaddish, you have this kind of paradox that something that at the same time is very, very holy and at the same time conveys tumah. So on the one hand, a Kohen can't go near a dead body. On the other hand, we treat a dead body with supreme reverence. It's It was the chamber that housed the soul in life. It's treated with great reverence. We're very careful when we perform taharas to adhere to all the requirements, to pay respects, do things that, we dress up in robes like the Kohen Gadol and things like that. There's this kind of paradox, if you like. So how do we respond as societies to the reality of life in this world and the challenges and the mortality that goes with it? So basically, like everything, there's a spectrum. So you've basically got, there's two extremes, neither of which is the Jewish way, right? You can simply be a hedonist. You can have a nice, say, look, okay, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we stuff it, and just make the most of it, enjoy life, all these silly people that think they're living for a higher purpose. It doesn't make any sense. There's no God or whatever. And, just enjoy life because you only get one shot at it. So, a physical life, right? Like many societies, right? Yeah, enjoy the pleasures of this world. Enjoy yourself, basically. Or you have asceticism where people say, I won't get married. I'll be celibate. I'll go live on a hilltop, not a hilltop, like in Israel, they'll have a mountain or something in a convent, and I'll take a vow of silence, and we'll live on bread and water, and we'll have very simple needs. Right? Catholic priests, I think, were never paid very well. They were paid a stipend because priests was expected to have very simple needs and a simple life. So on the one hand, you can say we'll basically worship and adore the physical, right? And of course, the ancient cultures, Greece and Rome and Egypt, that was very much the way, physical pleasure and worship of the physical form, the Olympics, right? The physical body, right? Or the Romans, great emphasis on, human might and physicality and pleasure, or which denies the spiritual. But on the other hand, if you're going to be ascetic and you're going to go, you're not going to engage with the world that you're living in for 120 years, you're going to just be a hermit, you're also denying yourself. Right? We've discussed before that it's an interesting question whether you can deny yourself pleasures in this world. Right? One of the reasons the Nazir, after his period of confinement, of growing his hair and avoiding wine and meat and other things he has to avoid, is he has to bring a sin offering. And one of the reasons given for that, why is it a sin? It's a mitzvah in the Torah to become a Nazir, if you choose to do so. So the sin is of denying himself the pleasures of this world. So you say, wait a minute, Tanya class always talking about, minimizing the pleasures of this world, and it's not about not having pleasure. It's about channeling it in the right way. So we should eat, we should drink, we should get married and procreate and enjoy it. We should be wealthy. We should sleep a good, nice, have a nice shot, particularly on Shabbos Yom Tov. By all means, it should all be done for a higher purpose and with our eye on the prize, as it were. So we don't advocate hedonism and we don't advocate asceticism. We advocate a healthy engagement with the world around us that recognizes we're physical beings. It recognizes our physical needs and limitations, recognizes our mortality, right? Surely that's why Jewish law, if that wasn't the case, we would say everybody has to fast on Yom Kippur, and if you drop dead, so be it. But we don't say that. We recognize the physical limitations of human beings. We even recognize that in terms of Jewish law and adherence to Jewish law. So what do? We sanctify the physical, right? Everything we do, we sanctify. We make life in our physical body and in this world a channel, a vehicle for the divine presence. Because we basically, there was another point also. When he talks about destruction, right? This is a classic, the analogy of the seed, right? The seed has to break down first in order to sprout. So destruction and aging and wasting away and ultimate mortality is an inevitable part of life as we understand it, right? Things grow, but things also are destroyed. That's just the way it goes. So we live in a physical world, which God said is very good. You can't be a hedonist and say there's no God and it's not his world. On the other hand, you can't be an ascetic and say, I won't enjoy God's world. So being a Jew is that we celebrate creation, the world, we celebrate the creator, and we do that by engaging with the world in the fullest way according to his rules. Okay. And any questions on that before we continue? It's a pretty fundamental understanding of spirituality in Jewish terms, and why many mitzvahs that we do involve the physical world. Okay, so now let's move on. So now let's look at this week's Tazria. We have a very curious thing. Let's read it and then we'll talk about it. Who would like to read? This is from Tazria, the first Tazria. Volunteers?
Shall I read?
Julian.
When a woman conceives and gives birth to a boy, she shall be Metzorah for 7 days, just as she is during the time of separation when she has a period. Then for 33 additional days, she shall have a waiting period during which her blood is ritually clean. Until this purification period is complete, she shall not touch anything holy and shall not enter the sanctuary. If she gives birth to a girl, she shall have for 2 weeks the same Metzorah status as during her menstrual period. Then for 66 days after that, she shall have a waiting period during which her blood is ritually clean.
Okay, so this is the idea that besides for the normal menstrual cycle, and the truth is nowadays, seems like perhaps in olden times, people were more hardy, and it was quite possible that after childbirth, in theory, a woman could go back to her sort of cycle relatively quickly. I'm not sure that's so common nowadays. So most of this is actually academic, because most women will bleed anyway for a period of time after childbirth, and they don't go to Metzorah until they stop bleeding. But hypothetically, if someone would stop bleeding from childbirth, they would still have to count this extra, basically 40 days for a baby boy, 80 days for a baby girl, before they go to the Metzorah. So during this time, they are tamei, they're impure. At the end of this period, they bring a burnt offering and a sin offering, and they then become pure. Right? Anyone know the classic explanation for the sin offering, by the way?
Oh, no, sorry, didn't
Didn't
hear.
catch what you said at the end.
Why does a woman who's given birth, which is the first mitzvah in the Torah, is to go forth and multiply, why does she bring a sin offering after? She brings a burnt offering, that's fine. Why does she bring a sin offering?
Isn't it because she's likely to have cursed and sworn when she was giving birth? Something
So I
like-
don't, correct. So I don't know if this is quoted anywhere in any holy books. I don't know if it's just a joke or if it's misogynistic or if it's tongue in cheek, but I definitely know it's true. But they say that, in the midst of labor, I've said before, I don't understand why in halacha the husband's allowed to go with. Usually the husband seems to be an impediment. But anyway, in the midst of labor, a woman will often scream at her partner and say, "You got me into this, you," a 4-letter word, and "I'm never speaking to you again. I'm never going through this again. I'm not having any more kids. I'm not going near you again. Whatever it is." Often, but not always, targeted at the person that made her pregnant, or just generally cursing and screaming. And if anyone's never been in a labor ward, it can be quite stressful because there's a lot of painful noise. So I did hear that it's basically for all the vows she made that she didn't really mean when she said, "I'm never doing this again. I'm never gonna." Right, and of course you shouldn't say that. It's like a vow. So that's what I heard once. Anyway, why does childbirth make a woman tamei? Okay, technically she's bleeding, and when she sees blood from down below, she has to go to Mikvah. But more fundamentally, why? And why is the period for a girl twice as long as that for a boy? Do we just say that it's a chag, it's something that's beyond our understanding, which is what some rabbis say, or is there some understanding of it? Any thoughts?
It's double because the child is a daughter, and the daughter will have the same thing as her.
Right? But more fundamental question. Yeah, correct, basically. That's what we usually say. More fundamental question. What did we just say about Tum and Tahara? What was my comment about where we usually find them? What are they usually connected with? Death. Right. So we understand that when a woman has a period, it's okay, for some people that might be by choice, but it's the loss of a potential life. Right. And anyone who's ever had fertility problems will tell you that there's actually a TV program coming up, which I was a consultant on, about a couple in Boreham Wood who you may know. I'll tell you who they are. They're going to be on the program, called the Meislishes, Saul and Shoshi Meislish, the members of Boreham Wood Shul. And they've been married for a number of years. They don't have children yet. And they speak about mikveh, and it's deeply personal, actually. It's quite a moving program. And, the feeling of disappointment every month when she gets a period. And that's another month that she didn't manage to get pregnant. So that we understand it's the loss of a potential life. We understand that when there's an actual death, then you have, the way we do Tahara is not really the 100% authentic. The 100% authentic way was people would be dipped in a mikveh. If you go to Carmel funeral chapels in San Francisco, they have a mikveh there, which is basically a large mikveh, like a mikveh you would see. I think it's raised slightly above the ground, and there's a hoist, and they put the bodies into the mikveh, basically. And we pour water over instead, which has the same effect. What's childbirth got to do with death?
You can die in childbirth very easily.
Well, besides for that. So I'm not qualified to comment. Maybe some of the women present who have given birth can comment on this. But I've heard people say, and it seems to make sense, it might explain also postnatal depression possibly as well, that sometimes, I don't know if often, but sometimes there is a slight sense of grief and bereavement, because whilst it's very exciting that you've got this living, breathing baby that you're now looking after, it's no longer in your body. You have this, you carried this child for 9 months and suddenly it's gone.
Mm.
Does that make any sense? I have heard people say that.
It didn't happen to me, but it makes sense. I understand
It makes
that.
sense. I never
Yeah.
thought of it. Yes, but I can
But-
see. Yeah.
Whilst you're very happy that your baby's been born safely, you've suddenly gone from being an expectant mother who's carrying a child that you're nurturing inside you to someone who's no longer doing that. Okay, obviously the child's born, which is very exciting and very beautiful. But there's also your body perhaps feels a sense of loss, and it goes through certain processes. So I have heard people say that, and they can relate to that. Obviously, it's joy. Look, it's like when a child leaves home, right? Because they've grown up and they get married and they move into their own home with their wife or their husband. It's the happiest day of your life as a parent. And there's also sometimes a slight sense of loss because you've lost your son and daughter. Of course, you haven't lost them, but it's when they move on to the next stage. Maybe that's the best way of describing it. You know, you're sad when a child leaves home. Of course, you want them to leave home because it means they've grown up. It means you can downsize. But at the same time, there might be a sense of loss because, you know, you've no longer got that familiar. So I have heard that. So I think that's one of the explanations sometimes given. So in terms of the physical body, the woman's body is going through a bereavement because it no longer has this life inside it, obviously for good reasons. And as we said, according to that, the life of a daughter is she herself will go on to give birth. So that's even more of in a sense, a loss. So there might be not a death, obviously, but there might be in terms of when we talk about Tumah and Tahara, what I often say to couples getting married is that we find that where there's a vacuum, basically, where there's a lacking, that's where Tumah enters. So when you have a bereavement, we've lost a person, the soul has left the body, there's now a vacuum, there's now the potential for Tumah. When you have menstruation, there's now a gap, there's now a loss, there's now a vacating, then there is the idea of Tumah. Yes, it might be technically linked to blood, but it's something more profound than that. Certain emptiness, perhaps. So maybe that makes sense to say. I'm not qualified to comment. I think maybe it makes sense. And it might well explain, you know, why do women get depressed after giving birth? They should be happy. It's not uncommon. You know, yes, it could be hormones. I wonder if it's also connected to this idea that your body has gone through a change, that your body, which has for 9 months been basically subservient to your child, suddenly you've got your body back, and maybe it's not as good a feeling as you might think it might be. I don't know. You know, just saying.
That's probably
Anyway.
true of miscarriage.
Certainly, obviously, that would definitely be true of miscarriage. And with miscarriage, or with stillbirth, you've got the worst of all worlds because sometimes you even have to go through labor. You know, I mean, one of the hardest things I have occasionally had to support people who have had to, you know, known that they've had, well, not even a stillbirth, I mean, what they call it, a premature. Can't think what you call it, but basically where the baby unfortunately is no longer alive, but they have to, you know, they have to induce and they have to give birth, and they know they're giving birth to a non-living child. It's a very painful experience, and the religious side of it is also very difficult because at these times the woman will become a niddah, so she won't be able to have that closeness with her husband. Rabbi Rappaport said, I remember many years ago, I think it's a good mantra to live by generally. You know, when everything lines up, I'm sure I've said this before, when everything lines up and, you know, keeping Shabbos enhances your life and switching your phone off is great, and having time with your family, and it fixes your marriage because you're a workaholic and now you have a day off once a week, you spend time with your spouse, and, you know, mikveh jazzes up your married life because once a month you take a night off and you go out, you spend time together and it's really exciting and so on. It's all great, but it's not always that way, right? Some people, maybe not nowadays, but we know back in the 20s and 30s, right? All these stories about people who lost their job every Monday morning, right? I saw a story recently of a chap who was asked to go to a work event on a Shabbos, and it was a very important event, and it was probably going to affect their potential for promotion, like a frum person. They came to their Rav and they discussed in detail how they could do it and what they could do. They could walk there and they could just have a glass of water, and obviously not, whatever it was, I don't remember. I think it was a social event, but, you know, a very, very loaded event where you had to be there kind of thing. And the Rav gave them some guidance and they agreed how they would do it and still maintain the integrity of Shabbos and so on and so forth. And a few months later, the rabbi sees this person, says, "Did you get the promotion?" He says, "No." He says, "Oh, what happened?" He says, "I never went to that event." He says, "Oh." He says, "You know, Rabbi," he says, I think it was his grandfather. He says, "My grandfather," he said, "without exaggeration, every Monday morning would look for a job because he was fired every Monday because he wouldn't work on Shabbos." He said, and he never wavered. And there were weeks sometimes he went without work and they didn't have food on the table, but he never wavered. He never went to work on Shabbos. He said, if he could do that, he said, I don't need to go to work to, even with dispensation from you. He said, no, Shabbos was too important. You know, we all know those stories from the people that, so try telling someone who's just lost their job that Shabbos is beautiful, going to enhance your family life, right? Try telling someone who's just lost a child how beautiful the laws of mikvah are when they just want a hug from their spouse and they can't because they're not supposed to. So it doesn't always work, right? And we still keep it because it's the Torah. So I think, you know, it's important to say that. You know, we're very good at selling mitzvahs to people. You should do this because, you know, it'll enhance your life. It's really meaningful. It's really beautiful. Even when it's not beautiful, it's not meaningful, we still do it. I think it's an important message. Anyway, so one fundamental understanding of purity and impurity is that, for starters, a lot of ancient cultures would glorify death, right? I just saw, complete tangent. I just saw a really weird story. I don't know if it's true or not. I want to check it out. So evidently there was a chap in Brazil who was you know, the ancient pharaohs would be buried with all their wealth, right? They wanted to take it with them to the next world. We, of course, say you can't take it to the next world. So there was this chap, I don't remember his name, he's a billionaire, and he said he's going to bury his Bentley that was worth like $400,000 because basically he wants to have it with him in the afterlife. He was very inspired by the pharaohs and he wants to have it with him in the afterlife. And he publicly announced that, you know, whoever wants to come and observe can observe, and basically dug a big hole and they were about to lower the car into the hole. And people say, no, don't do it. It's a terrible waste. You know, give it to charity or not. Give it to charity. Don't be silly. Anyway, basically, it was a publicity stunt to promote organ donation. And he said, well, I'm not actually going to bury my car. He said, but I don't agree with this, by the way. But anyway, he said, you don't need to bury a car. Why do you bury a body full of organs, which could be used to save lives, when you could donate your organs? And basically, it was a shock publicity stunt. And apparently, organ register signups went up 30% after that. And it was an extremely successful advertising campaign. Interesting. I'm not convinced it's true. It sounds a bit bizarre to me. But anyway, I'll try to Google it and see if I can fact check it. So I don't totally agree with that premise, obviously, 100%, but it's an interesting idea. But anyway, we don't glorify death, right? Islam, unfortunately, at least in the present day extremist form, seems to glorify death. I don't know. I do know that's not a mainstream view. I know because I work in chaplaincy and I do a lot of training, and at least according to my Muslim colleague, Islamic law has very similar ideas about saving lives and so on. So it's very sad that we're presented often with a public face of something which is basically a death cult. That doesn't seem to be authentic, but unfortunately, that's what we're presented with. I saw many years ago that Rabbi Riskin, who is, I'm not sure he's very well these days, he's the Rav of Efrat, I'm very respected, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. But I think about 10, 15 years ago, he'd written an article or something. I think it wasn't publicized, probably for good reason. But basically arguing that whilst traditionally Judaism had seen Islam as being monotheistic, there was a problem with the kind of whole, glorification of death aspect to it, which had crept in the Middle East. And it's very hard to get excited about a monotheistic faith that is basically a death cult in some instances, and arguing for a sort of reclassification in halakha. I don't think it got much traction, probably because it would have probably started another Middle East war. But it's philosophically an interesting idea. We do not glorify death in Judaism. We deal with it. It happens. We recognize it, but we don't glorify it. Right? On the contrary, we see it as we simplify it. If you look at the rituals around, the way we bury people is very simple and very plain, and the focus then shifts to the spiritual side and the shiva and so on. And I was at a levaya if I mentioned this here, about 2 months ago in the Adas, which was very different from most of the levayas I go to. It was a very sad levaya. It was a friend of mine lost his wife, who's about our age. They've got 3 young children. But it seemed almost quite casual, really. They did the tzeduk hadin. There was no eulogy. They don't do eulogies evidently. Everyone's equal. Don't get up and say, exaggerated things about people. Very simple service. Everyone took part in the levaya. I think about 12 people actually carried the mace, and then we did the burial. It was very simple. People brought earth in, went back to the hall, and it was all over relatively quickly, and it seemed almost quite understated. And I commented to one of my colleagues who was there, who was also a United Synagogue rabbi. I said, it seems, I don't know, a bit kind of low key almost. And he said, yeah, but he said, this is really what it's supposed to be. He said, we, in our circles, in our synagogue circles, the emphasis is that, levaya is a huge thing and it's so important and this and that. And some people don't even do the shiva nowadays. He said, whereas here the emphasis was, yes, the levaya, obviously, and actually the rabbi got up and said, we must remember that Sarah is not in the box. Sarah is now on her way to Shamayim, her soul, obviously, and he spoke in very religious terms. It was quite strange the way he said it. We don't usually say that at most levayas, but actually, as my colleague pointed out to me, that's really what it's all about. And we don't really understand. Sometimes we see, from Israel and so on, that it's quite simple as well. Yes, also eulogies, and often they're very large crowds, but actually the emphasis, it's a part of the process, but it's just a part, which is followed by the shiva and the kaddish and the shloshim and, learning and davening and mitzvahs and all the things that we do for the mace. So actually, we probably, in the traditional community, there's a lot of build-up around the actual funeral service because that's what people come to and that's what they attend. That's where they expect a certain degree of formality. But in particular, more formal communities, it's a lot more understated. We do not glorify death. We don't build huge pyramids for people. We don't build, monuments. We don't take anything with us. Basically, that's it. You leave this world. And was it say in the liturgy? It's as if they never, it's as if you never were. It doesn't matter how you live 70 or 80 years. It's as if it was nothing. That's it. It's like a what is it like a puff in the night? How does it go? And that's it. We don't glorify mortality or death. It's just a fact of life. It's one of those things that happen. Let's look at a few more sources for that. T.S. Eliot. Thanks to Rabbi Sachs. Who's a good poet? Who wants to read T.S. Eliot? Anyone?
I'll do it if you like.
Go on, Iris.
If nobody else wants to.
Yeah.
Webster was much possessed by death and saw the skull beneath the skin. Don, I suppose, was such another. He knew the anguish of the marrow, the ache of the skeleton. Freud coined the word thanatos to describe the death-directed character of human life.
Right. So a few examples of perhaps glorification or centrality of death. Let's see what Judaism has to say about the role of death. Here we go. Number 5. We all know this from Hallel. Who'd like to read?
I'll read it.
Go on.
The dead cannot praise the Lord, nor any who go down into silence.
Right, nothing great about being dead. You can't praise God. Right, that's it. You know, pretty final. What else? Let's see. This we say every day. From Mizmor Shir Chanukas in the mornings. Would you like to read that?
What is to be gained from my death, from my descent into the pit? Can dust praise you? Can it declare your faithfulness?
Right. That's not to say that death doesn't happen, but we don't focus on it. We don't center around it. Right. Let's see what it says in Devarim. I'll do this one. Right. We say this every time. You who hold fast to God are all alive today. Right. And we say, of course, Eitz Chaim Hi, it's a tree of life. Right. Moses tells us in Devarim, he says, I call heaven and earth to witness that I've given you a choice of life and death, of blessing and curse. Choose life. So in Judaism, the emphasis is on life. Right? Tomorrow is Yom HaShoah. Rabbi Sachs always used to say, you know, unfortunately, people learn about how the Romans lived and how the Greeks lived, right? And how the Vikings lived and how the Jews died. It's not actually what Judaism is about. And I'm sure that the J-Roots tours that Michael takes, there's no, you know, and Zach take, there's a lot of emphasis on the Jewish life. Yes, you go to the camps. Yes, you see death. But there's much more to it than that. You'll see how Jewish life was in Poland and these places, because, you know, it's not about, it's very sad that it's often about how we died, but it's about how we lived as well. Or the other take on it, I think it's an Aish saying they used to in the Discovery program, where people say, you know, what is it worth dying for? The question should be, what is it worth living for? Right? You know, we don't glorify, unfortunately, we become a little bit centered on these things, particularly in a post-Shoah generation, but it's not healthy. It's not what it's about. And even when we memorialize and Yizka, it always should be that for the living to take to heart and to take lessons and to take inspiration. So Kedusha and holiness is about life and living, and therefore Tumah, the opposite, is often about the lack of life. Let's see how the Kuzari, Rabbi Huda Halevi, explains in his mystical philosophical work the idea of Tumah. Here we go. Who's feeling philosophical?
I do it.
Go on.
A dead body represents the highest degree of loss of life, and a leprous limb is as if it were dead. It is the same with the loss of seed, because it had been endowed with living power, capable of engendering a human being. Its loss, therefore, forms a contrast to the living and breathing.
Right, and the same would apply to the menstrual loss as well. Right? So the highest loss you can have is loss of life, because life is the highest value in Judaism. So it's just equal and opposite. It's as simple as that. So interestingly, he says elsewhere, it's a very curious thing we find. Right? I don't know if anyone's ever had a Cohen in your car with you. It depends how from they are. But it's quite possible that if you were ever driving with a Cohen, you went past the cemetery, they might have asked you to close the windows in the car. Okay? So that, anyone have that experience?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess you don't hang out with as many Kohanim as I do. So I think I first came across it with fish oil in Birmingham. So curious question. Does it apply to Jewish cemeteries or non-Jewish cemeteries?
Wouldn't it apply to both?
So we say that the concept of Tumah and Tahara, Tumas Mace Germany, only applies to the Jewish dead. So if you went past a non-Jewish cemetery, you actually, strictly speaking, you wouldn't contract Tumah impurity. So don't ask me how that works scientifically, okay? I don't know. But anyway, so why not? Interesting. So 1 second. A Jewish cemetery and death in Judaism conveys this impurity, and outside of Judaism it doesn't. What's that about? So the Kuzari is a very interesting explanation. Not come across this before. He says, why do the laws, and conversely, a non-Jew is not bound by the laws of purity and impurity. You had a non-Jewish servant or worker or something, they wouldn't be affected to the same degree. They don't become impure from these things. Why not? So interestingly, the Kuzari suggests that because, I don't know who's making noise, but it's very loud, by the way. Beryl, is that coming from yours, possibly? Don't know who that is. Aeroplane, someone, no? Someone on an aeroplane? Anyway.
Not hear it?
Yeah,
There's an aeroplane here going over.
Oh, that's what it
Metzorah.
There we go, right, okay. I hope it's a friendly one. Right. Yeah, sorry, Beryl, it's not you, it's Jeff. Okay. So Rabbi Yehuda Levi interestingly suggests that the reason the laws of purity apply to us is because Judaism is the supreme religion of life, and it has this hypersensitivity to life and death, and you know, the importance of life and saving life and the preciousness of life. That's something that's very unique to Judaism. So this fine distinction between life and death, between purity and impurity, is actually one that's unique to Judaism. It's an interesting idea. I've not seen it anywhere else, but he brings it in the Kuzari. That's quite an interesting idea. Now, next thing, there's a sensitivity then to the birth of a child as well. Right? All animals give birth in some form or another. It's very natural. Let me ask you a question. If you would read the book of Bereshit, what conclusion would you come to if you knew nothing of the biological laws of childbirth? What would be the obvious conclusion you would come to about the process of having a child from all of the matriarchs? Sorry?
Wasn't easy for them to give birth.
Wasn't easy. Many of them were infertile, many of them struggled, many of them needed miracles or prayer or intervention, right? Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Hannah, that we read about, right? And throughout Tanakh, it was often not an easy process. So interesting message there as well. Even though it's the most basic human function in the world is the need for intimacy and intercourse. And it's one of the most basic animal desires that exists. And it's the first mitzvah is to go for the multiply. And yet at the same time, it's not a given, and it's not something that's just biology. If it was just biology, it would work when it's supposed to, and it wouldn't work when it's not. And ironically, it's often the other way around. So even something that other cultures might see as natural is also miraculous. A child is miraculous, right? Judaism is all about first mitzvah is to have children. I think I talked about the experience I had where I'd spoken at Ron Kemp's Tazria, spoke about the joy of, you know, having children and grandchildren. I think it was the Parsha that week. And somebody contacted me afterwards and said they were very offended because I think it was their uncle or their aunt or somebody in the family had never managed to have children, and they were very hurt by this. And I thought about it a lot afterwards, and I thought, you know, it would be wrong to give a sermon to a crowded shul that disenfranchises a portion of people. You know, it'd be wrong to get up and speak about, you know, the only fulfillment comes through marriage when there are people who are not married. But surely at a levaya, your primary purpose is to praise the person and talk about their life. So, you know, I mean, it's a bit like saying we shouldn't get up and say, oh, it's so wonderful that all the kids married Jewish and had Jewish grandchildren, so much nachas for Mr. So-and-so in his old age, because there'll be people at the levaya who don't have Jewish grandchildren. Well, I'm sorry, but it's not about them. It's about the person who's being eulogized. I agree we can be sensitive about things, but anyway, having children is not something we take for granted. It's miraculous, it's wondrous, it's very spiritual, right? That's why we often say that women are closer to God, because they have the potential to give life through childbirth. So with that in mind, when a mother goes through childbirth, first of all, there's a risk. Somebody mentioned the danger of dying in childbirth, right? That's nowadays it's minimal, but it used to be quite dangerous, right? Rachel died in childbirth. She's also separated from part of her body. The rabbis actually describe the child like a limb of the mother. So yes, in a sense, it's like an amputation. There is a detachment there. So that's number one. So that makes it all very, both spiritual and physical. There's a very physical aspect to it. There's a spiritual aspect to it. There's an aspect of change and loss and detachment. And that might be relevant. There's also another interesting idea also, which is there is a principle that if you are engaged in one mitzvah, you're exempt from other mitzvahs. This is the classic one that says that, Chevra Kadisha talks about in the Gemara and Brochas. Nowadays, not so much of a thing, but if you were accompanying a mace, then you're exempt from saying the Shema because you're doing the mitzvah of Havayas HaMace. So nowadays you get in a car, but there were times it might have taken several hours to walk to the cemetery, perhaps. You might have missed the time of davening. Or you're technically exempt because you're doing another mitzvah, right? The classic one we all know is an onan. Somebody who's had a bereavement is exempt from other mitzvahs because they are busy with the mitzvah of Kavod HaMace, of making sure that all the arrangements are in place. So on that principle, right, why is, besides for the tumah and the mikveh and that aspect, why is this woman who's just given birth told that she doesn't have to come to the temple for 40 days or 80 days for a girl? The answer is because,
Maybe because she's breastfeeding.
Right. She's got her own, she's got her own holy work to do. She doesn't need to be at the holy temple communing with God because basically right now with her child, looking after this newborn child, whether she's breastfeeding or not, right? But certainly if she's breastfeeding, looking after this child is itself a sanctuary, holiness. So there's that aspect also, that besides for all the kind of, the physical side of it, there's also the idea that actually these laws mean that she becomes exempt from her normal obligations, precisely because she has other obligations which are, take over from that. I don't know, maybe it's more of a thing in larger Haredi communities, but, often around Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur time, not everyone can go to shul. And if you can go to shul, if you have young kids, you can't spend the whole shul in Yom Kippur. My wife hasn't had a proper Yom Kippur in shul for years because I have kids that need looking after. That's the reality. It could be if I wasn't a rabbi, I would look after them more at home. But the fact is, the reality is I'm busy in shul. So it's particularly pronounced, maybe if you're not a rabbi in Rebbetzin, one of you could go home, the other could go to shul for a few hours. But that's the reality. So every year you always get people saying, when I was in seminary, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we davened with such fervor and, such commitment. And now I have a baby and I can't even daven for 10 minutes without the baby crying. And, all the great rabbis would say, but you're looking after your child is your avodah right now. That's how you serve God. You're nurturing your child and raising the next generation right now is more important than your davening. So don't see it as a, disadvantage or a loss. See it as, and that's why you're exempt from. You're probably exempt from davening. If women try to daven daily, and there's different views on the obligation to daven for women. Certainly, if you were with a child and you were exhausted and you were nursing and the child was up all night and whatever, and you didn't manage to get up for davening, then I think that's totally understandable because you're busy with a very important mitzvah. You're busy with something else. So the same thing when it comes to the temple service, the fact that those 40 or 80 days she didn't come to the temple, not a punishment necessarily. It's that she's got her own sanctified, sacred space which takes priority. And it's not very popular to say nowadays. Talk about equality and whatever. It's yes, there are women who give birth and go back to work a week later, and the husbands stay home and bottle feed and whatever. But I think it's fair to say that we understand that even in today's topsy-turvy world, we understand why a mother would have a different bond with a child from a father in practical terms, and why there's a certain role that mothers play, and that's not always the case, and fine, whatever, but that's, more often than not the reality. It makes sense that the Torah would recognize that and would say, you've got your job is so important right now. First of all, it's not just a biological thing that you have had this child, it's also a very special spiritual holy thing, and it's a mitzvah, and it's a miracle in itself. Secondly, this puts you in a special category that you've got things on your mind which are very holy, special things. And in the same way that somebody who's involved in a mitzvah is exempt from a mitzvah. I always think, if I get a call to go visit someone in hospital, end of life, if I have to daven mincha first, I'll daven mincha quickly. By the same token, though, if somebody needs comfort, right? Bikkur cholim is a mitzvah to visit the sick. You know, and you go visit the sick and you need to be at someone's bedside for hours, and because of that, you don't manage to have a mincha, it's probably fine. And we don't try to arrange it that way, but it's probably fine. And that's the reality. You're involved in one mitzvah, you're exempt from other mitzvahs. So there's also that idea as well. Let's see what Rabbi Sachs has to say. That was the same thing I just said. Childbirth exempts the new mother from attendance at the temple because her bedside replicates the experience of the temple. She now knows what it is for love to beget life. In the midst of mortality, to be touched by an intimation of immortality. That's the other thing. Childbirth is a miracle. It feels miraculous. It feels incredible to watch your child that's, you know, growing and whatever. So when Ellie was born, somebody said to me, you know, said, how can you not believe in miracles if you watch the child be born? It's an amazing thing. So she's touching the divine. She doesn't need the temple. She's got her own little miraculous sacred space. Does the father have it as well? Okay, maybe he doesn't feel it quite so acutely because he didn't go through all the pain and whatever. Right, there we go. So a few thoughts on Tum and Tara, particularly this curious thing of childbirth, why it's in the same category. It could be to do with the sense of loss. Could be that it's more profound than that. It's not so much about the blood and the bleeding and the physicality, but it's about the sort of spiritual idea that Tum and Tara is not just about being impure, but it's also about when in your time of Tumah, you're exempt from certain things. And a person who is right now has just given birth and this is their top priority, you could say that as well. Any thoughts, questions?
Very interesting. Things I hadn't thought about. So it got too hot outside, so we've come in.
Right.